Okay, let's jump right in. First things first, I'm going to go ahead and quickly sketch this square. You'll notice I'm drawing each line separately as opposed to trying to draw the entire square in one go. That's a pretty good tip, is to be intentional about your lines. Lift your pen after each line and resist trying to connect them. Anyway, I'm going to start placing some of my major lines down to fill the primary shapes in my scene. And while I do that, I want to share some observations and some tips I've learned throughout this process. You might notice that this drawing is at the bottom of my page. I have a total of 12 urban sketch studies on this page, so I encourage you to check out the other videos, which by the time this video comes out, I'll probably have already started to release my next set of 12. Okay, so back to my observations and tips. The first thing that I wanted to talk about are my mistakes. If you watch any of my videos, and I'm sure it won't take you long to spot a mistake, but mistakes are okay. In fact, the more mistakes you make, the more you learn about your process and where you might need work. And more importantly, how to overcome those mistakes. Initially, I started to shy away from scenes that I felt were too tricky and might cause me to make more mistakes. But by the end of this series, I was actually looking forward to those more complicated scenes. You really grow as an artist, in my opinion, the more you push yourself. And despite your mistakes, you'll notice that if you keep moving forward, most of the time your sketches will turn out just fine. Now, this leads me to my next observation. Even if you make a mistake, the final sketch will look better than when you started. This is a common thing in art. The initial phases may not look the greatest, but trust the process. Power through the mistakes, and you'll notice that things will come together and your final image will almost always look better. This is the Gestalt principle in practice. The whole of the image will be perceived rather than the individual elements, meaning that the small mistakes will be overshadowed by the rest of your image. Now, the next tip that I wanted to share is to use your existing lines to help you place future lines. I've talked about this before, but for example, I've already drawn some major details in my scene. So now when I go to add additional detail, I know exactly where to place it based off the spacing of the previous detail. I'm using my reference photo constantly to confirm distances and how that translates into my sketch. Additionally, I'm also looking for negative spaces. This could be a whole section of itself, but another method I use to make sure I have proper placement is to look at the size of the empty space or negative space in my sketch and make sure it matches that of my reference photo. In fact, a good sketching practice is to try to draw your scene with just drawing the negative spaces first. You'll often see that your proportions and detail are more accurately placed when you do it this way. The next tip is to experiment. Experiment with different textures, styles, whatever, as long as you experiment. For example, I chose this scene specifically because it had strong angular shadows that I hadn't really experimented with before. If you find yourself shying away from drawing certain things like plants, details, or textures, or if you haven't tried a loose sketch or haven't tried mixed media, now is the time to experiment. Start practicing now and you'll find out that you only get better from here. Another tip is not to compare yourself to others. This is a very common thing to do. Everyone is at a different stage in their learning process, and it wouldn't be fair to yourself to compare yourself to somebody else. Do I wish I was better at perspective and detail? Of course, but that's why I practice. Now, on the opposite side of that, it may seem counterintuitive to what I just said, but I go out and watch different artists on YouTube and see how they approach a drawing or sketch. I like to learn from their style. I pay attention to their process. In fact, one of the things that I want to work on is how to get the illusion of more detail with fewer lines. There are artists out there whose work appears to contain an incredible amount of detail. However, it's all just the suggestion of detail, created with minimal but well-placed line work. But again, be careful not to compare. Look for things that you can use with your style and that fit with you. If you like this content, please subscribe and give it a like. It really helps me know what type of content you want to see in the future.